these voters that haven't been, my count, I had 3.8 million voters in Florida are not able to participate in partisan primaries. Is that a correct number?
That's right. I mean, think about this, 3.8 million registered voters that are NPA in Florida who are shut out of primary elections simply because they're independents. And that includes over 1 million voters of color. Think about that. Over 1 million voters of color are shut out of primary elections in the state of Florida. It's by far the largest act of voter suppression in the state and one of the largest acts of voter suppression in the country, for that matter. And that matters for a variety of reasons. Florida taxpayers pay millions of dollars for primary elections. These are public elections. And yet a third of the electorate, including 1 million voters of color, can't vote in these primaries. And that has a lot of consequences, because when you shut out a third of voters and you restrict the choices of voters, because remember, even if you can vote in Florida primaries today, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you can only vote in a Republican primary or a Democratic primary. You can't vote for the best candidate. You can only vote for the best candidate from your party. So when you shut out a third of all voters and you restrict the choices of party voters, it means that only the most partisans of each party get to vote. What happens when that occurs? Well, it means that you get hyper-partisanship in the State House. You get dysfunction in the State House. And that's exactly what you're seeing in Tallahassee right now. You're seeing a legislature that doesn't represent the people. And it's not hard to understand why. When a third of the people can't vote, and of the 2/3 that can, they're limited in their choices, then you get elected officials who know that the only way they can get elected and stay in office is to listen to and only be responsible to the small number of hyperpartisans in their party. It's very harmful to representative government in terms of voter participation, and it's just harmful to the body politic altogether.
I do agree with you that we are not represented at the state level. I'm a little concerned about this particular way of doing the open primary, because I know it's widely been talked about that if we had had this in place for the 2018 gubernatorial election, we would have had our choice of Adam Putnam and Ron DeSantis. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I'd say it's false. It's sad that that the reports that have been done about this have been done by politicians. When politicians do academic analysis, you get bad analysis. The truth is that there's no academics that have supported any of those studies, and there's a reason for that, because they're false. You can't take the data from one election and feed it into another election system and think you're going to get anything of value. It's like taking the election in Italy and trying to put it into an American election. You can't do it. It's a bad methodology. It doesn't work. So how do you see what would happen? Well, you look at states and you look at locations that have adopted the system that Amendment 3 would propose, and you find a lot of really interesting and exciting things. In California, for example, which was a blue state, they adopted the same system as Amendment 3 would bring. The Black caucus went up 50%. The Latino caucus went up 25%. Both caucuses have been bigger today and in every election since Top 2 was enacted than they were before. California has more statewide elected officials of color than any state in the country. 7 statewide elected officials, including Secretary of State, the Attorney General. I mean, let's be honest, our current Democratic nominee for Vice President, Kamala Harris, won in an Amendment 3 type election for Attorney General. She won in an Amendment 3 type election for Senator, and now she's the party Vice Presidential nominee. But you don't have to just look at California. 85%, and several states have the system, and they've had the same results as California, but you don't just have to look at them. You can look at other examples. For example, 85% of municipalities use the same system as envisioned by Amendment 3. What happens there? Well, you look at what the League of Cities found. They found in cities that have the same type of nonpartisan system that Amendment 3 has, Black mayors were elected at 29% rate. At the system envisioned by the status quo, 17%. The election of Black mayors went up significantly. And you don't have to even look nationally. You can look right in Florida, because most Florida cities have the Amendment 3 system. And most Floridians are pretty happy with it. In fact, I'd say most Floridians, at least that I've talked to, find their local elected officials to be more responsive and more representative than their statewide officials. Those officials are getting elected in an Amendment 3 system, including, by the way, your example of Andrew Gillum, who won 2 elections in Tallahassee under an Amendment 3 style system before he lost because of under a status quo system in the general election. So the evidence in Florida, outside of Florida, is overwhelmingly positive that Black and Latino candidates do better. And you can do back of the envelope math all you want, but there's no academic support for the claim, none whatsoever. And let's be honest, if the claim had any merit, and I think this is really important, if the claim had any merit, if it really did discriminate against Black candidates in any way, then why is it that in 8 years that President Obama and former Attorney General Holder investigated voter suppression all across the country? They investigated thousands of complaints against voter suppression tactics. There was not a single complaint against a top 2 system in any of the states that employ it, in any of the cities that employ it, thousands of cities, not a single complaint. And moreover, when the Democratic and Republican parties both sued to try to get Amendment 3 off the ballot, why did they not use this argument? Why didn't they say it was against the law, that it was a violation of the Voting Rights Act? Because they know it's not a real, when you go into a court of law, you actually have to use evidence, and there's none. So they use hyperbole, they use back of the envelope math. Truth is that all the evidence shows the complete opposite. And it's really that simple. And it's really that simple. Are you there for the voters? If you are, 4 million can't vote, including 1 million voters of color. Right now, that's real. Go to the Secretary of State's office. The numbers are right there. 4 million voters. So that's what we're dealing with right now in the state of Florida. We have the opportunity to enfranchise 4 million people overnight. If we don't take that chance, if we don't do that, not only are we hurting those voters, but we're really hurting the overall system that, quite frankly, so many people are worried about in Florida, that's not being representative, that's a system that is dysfunctional, that is not giving the people good policy, good representation. We need to change the system. If you're happy with status quo politics in Florida, don't vote for Amendment 3. But if you think there's a problem in Florida, Amendment 3 is a very important part of the solution.
Why top 2 as opposed to other kinds of open primaries that other states are using? Why did your group go with the top 2 model of open primary?
Well, to be clear, I'm not the ballot campaign. I'm just an expert on the issue. But so I didn't go with it. But I do support it, and I'll tell you why I support it. I support it, I think, for 2 very important reasons. One, because it not only enfranchises independent voters, but it gives every voter, independent, Republican, Democrat, full choice, right? You no longer, in a top 2 system, you don't have a Republican primary and you don't have a Democratic primary. You have a public primary. It's taxpayer funded. It's already public, but you have one public primary. All the candidates are on the ballot, all the voters vote, and the top vote getters go on to the general election. That means that every voter gets to choose the best candidate for every position. So if you're a Democrat, you may be voting for all Democrats in the state legislature. But what about sheriff? What about county commissioner? You may want to vote for somebody else, but you can't. And the second reason why I think top 2 is so important is because of a very interrelated reason. Our elections in the state of Florida are highly, highly uncompetitive. almost 45% of state legislative races see candidates running unopposed in the general election. That means that when you, as a voter, go to the ballot box, you only have one person to vote for. And so when you have voters saying, well, my vote doesn't matter, my vote isn't going to change anything. Well, the truth is in those races, it won't. Because there's only one candidate. Your vote doesn't matter. That's why the primaries are so critical. And what a top two system does as compared to a more simple open primary system, it creates significant competition. So when a state like California, for example, had a similar rate of unopposed elections and a similar rate of lack of competition. So in Florida, not only are there 45% of races unopposed, but only 15% of races are considered competitive. When you have a top two system, it increases competition overnight. Unopposed races go away. And parties are forced to compete in every race. That works for the voters. That gives the voters real choice in their elections. And that's really, really important.
So what do you say to the argument, or how money would come in? Because I know there's already a lot of issues with money in politics, and we really need campaign finance laws.
Absolutely.
It's tougher. Campaign finance laws is where we need to be focusing. But I'm just imagining, and the reason I haven't studied this issue a lot, which is why I'm very thankful that you're on here, and I'm also going to at some point have the other side on here as well. But how money comes into it in a case where, and this is already happening, where and I'll just say in the Republicans, because that's the one I know about, where they will fund a candidate to go against a Democrat and try to knock them out that way, because that just kind of happened in the Senate race that we just had in Seminole County. So I'm using that example. How would we control that happening when essentially anybody could be in the primaries? How do you suggest we control that problem?
I think campaign finance is an issue. I don't think top two adds or subtracts from that issue, quite honestly.
Okay.
When you take the parties out of the control of the primaries, the state's in control of the primary, right? The same way it is in the general election. So the state's running the primary, like it quite frankly always has, but the parties are out of the position of deciding who can and can't participate. That's really it. The state still runs the primary election like it runs the general election. And all the campaign finance protections are in place, remain in place. Do we need more campaign finance protections throughout the election system in Florida and throughout the country? Of course we do. We certainly support it. But there's nothing about the top two system that implicates more or less campaign finance issues. What it does do, and I failed to mention this earlier, but it's a really important, I think, part of the equation, is that when you take the parties out of controlling who can and can't participate in the primaries and deciding, you have a lot more interesting candidates come about. And more importantly than that, you have candidates who are in a position now where they're not running in a Republican primary or a Democratic primary. They don't just have to placate the hyper-partisans of the Republican side or the hyper-partisans of the Democrat side, right? It's just one public primary. So that means candidates actually have to reach out to everyone in their district. Right now in Florida, whether you're a Republican politician or a Democratic politician, you know that in order to get elected and stay in office, you just have to talk to and be representative of the hyperpartisans that vote in the primary. That's it. In a top two system, you actually have to be representative to everybody in your district, because everybody in your district gets to vote in the primary. And that means that in order to get elected and stay in office, you actually have to listen to them. You have districts in Florida, for example, that are 80% Republican registration. If you're a Democrat living in that district, your vote doesn't count. Your representative doesn't have anything to do with you, doesn't listen to you. You literally don't matter as a citizen in that district. Top two system, the complete opposite. The winner of a top two system in that same district, regardless of a higher voter registration of one party, knows that in order to beat the other person, they're going to have to actually reach out to everybody in their district, because the candidate that does that is the candidate that wins. That's what democracy should be. We shouldn't be creating all these artificial barriers between voters and politicians that limit who can vote, that limit the politician's ability to actually connect with and represent their entire district. That's what the laws in Florida currently allow for. And that's why we have so many political problems in Florida. Certainly not the only reason, but it's certainly a big reason. And a top two system in particular addresses those issues and creates and empowers a lot more voters.
Since you mentioned voter suppression, what was your position on the Amendment 4 and how the voters overwhelmingly passed the amendment and our legislature made all those barriers to actually get it, where the felons who served their time could actually vote? What were you involved in that at all?
I was not directly involved, but I've been a big supporter of Desmond Meade's for years. I think what he did was heroic. And I've been I'm a big supporter of what he did. I'm excited that he's been successful in some of the recent litigation against the legislature. But I would say a couple things about that. You know, the interesting thing about in France, you know, so many voters came out and they said former felons should have a right to vote, period. And yet so many of those former felons who were supposedly enfranchised by Amendment 4 are still shut out. Why? They're independent voters. So sure, Amendment 4 lets them vote in the general election, but those voters are still shut out of the primary, including many, many voters of color. Amendment 3 enfranchises all of them in every election, not just the general election, but every public election, and that's really critical. And second thing that I think is really interesting, and I think it's worth noting, both the Democratic and Republican parties have fought tooth and nail against Amendment 3. That certainly wasn't the case with Amendment 4. It had a lot of Democratic Party support. Amendment 3, both parties have been opposed. They've been opposed from the beginning. Both parties filed long legal briefs trying to keep Amendment 3 off the ballot. Party insiders of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party don't want this because it empowers voters and takes away some of their power. They lost in the litigation. Interestingly enough, they never brought up some of the claims about the Voting Rights Act because they're not real. But they have both parties insiders have been opposed to this from the start. Quite frankly, I think that's a good thing. Because I think you learn a lot when Republicans and Democrats in the state of Florida agree on something, when both parties agree on something, well, and in opposition, well, then I think we're on the right track, quite frankly. And that's where we are with Amendment 3. The insiders hate it from both parties, but it empowers voters, it gives them real choice, and it would move some of the power from the insiders and the special interests to the voters. That's what democracy is supposed to be, and that's what this amendment does.
That's interesting, because I heard the same argument from another person that said because they are both opposing it, it must be really bad, was the argument. So it's interesting how much debate this amendment is bringing forth. Very, very interesting. Let's see.
Look, I mean, the Republican Party in Florida, like you noted with Amendment 4, has been undertaking one of the worst voter suppression efforts in the country. And they pull out all the stops. And I think it's a real shame that the Florida Democratic Party, which by any measure has been certainly much, much better on the issue of voter suppression, is allied itself with the Republican Party and wanting to suppress 4 million voters. I think that is a shame. I think it's the wrong direction. But that's the position that the party's taken.
Well, I had heard someone arguing about, they were saying that Democrats have historically done voter suppression back in, I don't remember the year, but they have in the past done voter suppression as well. But the point you did make is that Democrats are being much better at it now. And I do think that there is a way possibly that their opposition could be for different reasons, because that often happens as well. And I think I also heard that the NRA is opposing this. Did you hear that as well, that the NRA is opposing this?
I didn't, but great. Bring it on. I mean,
yeah.
Again,
well,
I mean, the people, you put together a list of opposition like party insiders in the NRA. Well, now we're really off. Now we're really smoking.
Okay. Well, what about the League of Women Voters? Because they were on your side and then they switched. So explain that one.
Well, I prefer the League of Women Voters explain it, because I'm still confused by it. The League of Women Voters did a 2-year study, which is still on their website, by the way. They did a 2-year study. They looked at the issue, and they said, we support open primaries, and we support the specific measure that is envisioned by Amendment 3. They went out and they petitioned for it. They petitioned for Amendment 3, and they came out and endorsed Amendment 3. And then what happened? Well, let's talk about what happened. What happened is that some Democratic Party insiders, after they lost the litigation, after they lost the ability to get this off the ballot by any means necessary, they start talking about how it disenfranchises, it hurts Black candidates. And they've been selling that wrong-headed impression with no evidence except their back of the envelope math. And they got the League of Women Voters to overturn it. And we talked to the League of Women Voters. They said, look, yeah, we did a 2-year study. We endorsed it. But I mean, if they're going to say it's bad for Black candidates, who are we in this climate to get to step up and confront that? That's what happened. They spent 2 years saying we endorse it, we think it's a good thing, and then in 2 days they overturned it because they got a phone call from some folks that said it's bad news. No, that's politics in Florida. That's what's so broken about politics in the state of Florida right now, is that a supposedly nonpartisan group could be so bullied as to drop 2 years of research and endorsement because of the specter that the party insiders are bringing up race. I think it's shameful, quite frankly, because there's no evidence of it. They've never been in a debate about it. There's no academics that support it. It's just wrong. But look, this is 2020. And for very good reason, race is an issue. And for very good reason, people want to make sure that what they do and how they act is not going to hurt people of color in any way. In fact, everybody is working, everybody who matters is working to empower people of color. And so you raise the specter that this hurts people of color, and people get skittish. I get it. But look, the numbers are the numbers. There's 4 million voters that are shut out of elections in the state of Florida, and over 1 million of them are people of color. Now, why don't they ever bring that up? Why is that never raised? 1 million voters of color are shut out of public elections, and they say this amendment is anti-voters of color. It's mind-boggling. But this is what happens when you sort of throw hyperbole against the wall, see what sticks, and never get into a legitimate debate about it. It's too bad. But look, here's the facts. The facts are that Amendment 3 would enfranchise 4 million voters. It would give every voter the right to choose the best candidate for every office. It would empower the voters in ways that they've never been empowered before in the state of Florida. It would create a political climate in Tallahassee, and this is why the NRA is so opposed. It would create a political climate in Tallahassee that is much more responsive to what the voters want. I'll tell you why the NRA hates it. The NRA hates it because even after a massacre of kids in a school in the state of Florida, they go to Tallahassee and they can't even get an audience with legislators. That's politics in Tallahassee right now. That's what the NRA wants to maintain. They hate it because a political culture that's more responsive means that when those kids go to Tallahassee, they get an audience, and as they damn well deserve. And the voters who overwhelmingly support gun control actually get that issue on the agenda and have real debate and get something passed. That can't happen right now in Tallahassee because of status quo. So, you know, there's a lot of folks who want to keep the status quo because of their personal positions. But it's not serving the people of Florida. It's not serving the people of Florida in so many ways. And Amendment 3 starts to break through that. That's why there's such a debate, because there's a lot of support for keeping the way things as they are by the insiders and the special interests. And they'll do anything and they'll say anything they can to make sure it stays that way.
Well, the League of Women Voters, I've read their statement, and it sounds like they still are very interested in an open primary. They just had a problem with this particular type, the top two. But also, I'm curious how would the implementation of this work, assuming the voters vote for it? Now, would the legislature be in charge of implementing like they did Amendment 4? How do you see that happening?
Yeah, of course they would have to. That's any change to election law, right? I mean, if you're, you know, look, we know the legislature is a problem. We know the legislature wants to get in the way of any type of reform. And that's always been part of sort of the reticence of the public around reform. Is like, oh yeah, sure. You're going to get us all excited about reform. We're going to pass it and the legislature is going to take it away. Here's why, you know, that's less likely to happen with Amendment 3. Because of the way the amendment works, the legislature is barred from appealing it, removing it back to the status quo for at least in one election cycle. So Amendment 3 will be the law and will have to be the law for at least an election cycle, and we'll get a lot of changes in Tallahassee before there can be any decision making about repeal. And yeah, will there be a legal fight in terms of implementation? Well, there's a legal fight anytime you pass a ballot initiative in Florida these days. This won't be any different. And truth be told, the campaign, as I know it, as one of the top legal teams in the state, one of the top Democratic Party legal teams. They do a lot of work for the Democratic Party. They're going to do a lot of work for Amendment 3, and they're ready and willing to go. They defeated both parties' attempts to keep it off the ballot. And, you know, there's no reason to believe they won't be similarly successful if the legislature tries to do the same.
Haley, do we have any questions in the chat right now?
No, none have come in, but do feel free if you're listening, you know, to put questions in the chat if you have them, and we'll ask those as well.
Yeah, because I pretty much, I had a lot of questions, but you were very thorough and covered questions that I was going to ask if you didn't get to them.
Well, it's an important discussion. I'm happy to answer any additional questions. I'm happy to. This is just really important. This is all about empowering voters, and quite frankly, that's what I do for a living. That's what I've done my whole career, and I'll talk about empowering voters for as long as you need me to.
So, do you think that this system would not cause? I guess I'm going to go political here, a Trump situation, because I feel like the Republicans really didn't want him, but that's what they got. So they got behind him. How would that play out in this type of a system?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the great features of this system is that it guards against that, because right now, a more closed system is much more likely to get a Trump like candidate on either side of the spectrum, and that's because only the hyperpartisans get to vote, right? Only the hyperpartisans get to vote in the primaries. Trump won with only winning a very small percentage in the primary, but it was just enough above his opponents. In a top 2 primary, everybody gets to vote. So the most partisan candidates, the most vitriolic candidates, do the worst in these types of systems, because those candidates don't thrive on building large coalitions. They thrive on organizing their base. And the base isn't enough to win an election anymore in a top 2 system. You need the whole electorate. You need to build the larger coalition. The candidate who builds the larger coalition is the one who wins. So that means going beyond not just your base and not just your party, but to NPAs and even members of the other party who you can reach out to and connect with. That is a really important feature of the top 2 system. It guards very well against extreme candidates, because it's almost impossible for them to break through this type of system. It has a very significant moderating effect on candidates and on candidate behavior.
Interesting. And do you have an example of a state other than California that's more aligned with Florida? What is one of the swing states use the open primary?
Well, the majority of states have open primaries. So let's be clear. One of the things that is so shameful about Florida is that it's only one of 9 states that has a completely closed primary that doesn't let NPAs vote. Only one of 9 states. 38 states have, 41 states have some form of open primary. Now, only 3 states have the top 2 system. It's a relatively new system. It's been in place it was actually invented in Nebraska. But it's in place in California and Washington State. Washington State is not quite as progressive as California. It's not. I wouldn't say it mirrors Florida, but it has certainly had some of the very same effects. It obviously empowers NPAs to vote. Candidates of color thrive, and politics is moderated, and politicians become far more productive. In all 3 states that have it, have some of the most productive legislatures in the country. And that's because when you get rid of hyperpartisanship, the legislatures start working for the people. They start working on good policy. They start coming together. They start finding bipartisan appeal. Nebraska's a red state. You're talking about other examples. Nebraska's a red state. Has 71% Republican registration. And yet Nebraska passed, it let immigrants, gave immigrants driver's licenses. It abolished the death penalty. It raised taxes, the gas tax, did all these types of progressive measures that you normally associate with a blue state. And yet it's a red state. Why? Because when you get the parties out of the way and you get their strict agendas out of the way and you let the politicians actually reach out to all their voters and be responsive to all their voters, you start seeing really interesting coalitions evolve. You start seeing a lot more bipartisanship. And you see a lot more production in the legislatures. They're all 3 of some of the highest production legislatures in the country. And it's also important, here's another distinction actually in terms of top 2 and open primaries. Voter turnout. Top 2 primaries have the highest voter turnout in the country, period. The Bipartisan Policy Center looked at voter turnout. This is a big issue in Florida, has one of the lowest rates of voter turnout. It's been an issue for years in the state of Florida. Top 2 primaries have the highest rate of voter turnout. Traditional open primaries have a little bit better, a little lower rate, but certainly better than closed primaries like Florida, which have the lowest rate of voter turnout in the country, or states like Florida with closed primaries. So open primaries of any kind increase voter participation. Top 2 more than any other.
And was Nebraska Was that the traditional open primary, the example you used?
No, Nebraska has a top 2 primary
Well,
for
that's
state
top two.
legislature.
Okay.
For state legislature.
It's one of
and
the three.
it's one of the
California,
biggest
Nebraska, and what's the third one?
Washington State.
Washington State. Okay. Okay.
It's really interesting. Nebraska is kind of a fascinating example of top 2 in action, actually, because their state legislature is elected in a top 2 system, but their federal representatives are elected in a traditional closed system. So what happens? Here's what happens. It's really interesting. Even though these are elected officials who are representing the exact same people, they get completely different outcomes. They vote very differently on the issues. So you see the state representatives, Republicans and Democrats alike, voting for immigration reform, while the federal counterparts, mostly Republican, are voting against immigration reform. Why? Because when the parties are running the system, and I'm sure you've seen this, you as an elected official, you have to follow what the party agenda is. Or you get what happens in a closed primary state, you get primaried if you don't follow the party agenda. But in a more open system, you do what the voters say. You do, and you're less beholden to what the party says you have to do. So you, as an elected leader, have a lot more freedom. It's not just for the voters. You, as an elected leader, no longer have to follow lock, stock, and barrel what the party agenda says. You can actually follow your conscience, follow what the folks in your district want, and actually represent them far better in an open system than a closed one.
As a minority in the representatives, I don't have that pressure of going along with my party, but I do see the Republicans have a lot of pressure to go along with their party, and they do. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, in Nebraska, the Republicans regularly caucus with the Democrats, even though they could run the tables if they wanted to. They're 70, the majority Republican legislature. But they regularly caucus with the Democrats. The Democrats have an almost equal number of committee heads, even though they're the minority party. It's unheard of in a state like Florida. But in a more open system, politicians have more freedom as well as the voters. And you start actually seeing people, people can denigrate politicians all they want, and it's an easy thing to do. I think most politicians actually want to do right when they run for office, but then they find themselves in a system where if they want to get elected and stay in office, they have to follow by a certain set of incentives. And the closed system like they have in Florida creates a whole host of incentives to act in a way that's against the public interest. A top 2 system breaks away some of those incentives, gives them a lot more freedom to be who they are and to represent their constituents properly. So this is a really important amendment. It's both for elected leaders, but again, this is all really comes down to it. It's about the voters. 4 million voters. A third of the electorate can't vote in public elections. Over a million are voters of color. And that's increasing. Latino independents are now 36% of the Latino vote. And it's getting bigger. It's sort of one of again, it goes back to I'm a Democrat, by the way. It goes back to one of the one of the great failures of the Florida Democratic Party is, their entire relationship with independent voters has been join our party or get lost. We don't want anything to do with you. Truth is that Florida Democratic parties had the registration advantage forever. It's gotten smaller, but they still have the registration advantage in Florida, and yet they can't win. You build an alliance with independent voters with a top 2 election, and you start actually working with independent voters through that system. I think the Democratic Party would flourish, but the insiders don't want it. They lose their control. It creates a lot more volatility as far as they're concerned because they can't predict who's going to win elections anymore. And politics today is all about predicting who's going to win and allocating your resources accordingly. It's too bad. It's a missed opportunity. But there's no missed opportunities in terms of what the voters will happen for the voters. This will give voters, it'll enfranchise millions of voters, and it'll give everybody far more choice, create better politic in Tallahassee. I mean, what else could you want from a reform? But I get it. The insiders don't like change. They don't want to lose some of their control. And, you know, they're going to raise, unfortunately, some really nasty allegations to try to kick this thing, you know, off from winning. I'll have a conversation with anybody who wants to tell them why they're wrong and why this is so important for the voters of Florida, because it is. So look, I encourage anybody to go to floridaopenprimaries.org, join the movement to empower all Floridians, to give them real choice. And I'm happy to continue having this discussion because it's a really important one for the future of Florida. And it's unfortunate that it's gone in this direction so far.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for coming on. I know you have to go, you have a hard stop for your next meeting coming up. So I just thank you for coming on. I did have one thing come up when you talked about the committee chairs in Nebraska. You said that the Democrats have about as many as the Republicans,
right?
Even though the Republicans have the
70% registration advantage and the majority of seats in the legislature.
So how do they figure out, did they do it based on, how do they figure out the committee chairs then?
They created a system of blind voting. So they vote for the best committee, they vote for the best person. Imagine that. The best person gets to be committee chair, not some political hack that the party leadership puts up that doesn't even care about the issue of which their committee is presiding. But they actually have a blind vote, which again, Republicans could run the tables in a blind vote, but they have a blind vote. They elect the best people for to head the committees, and the Democrats do extremely well.
So they just do that amongst themselves, among the legislators.
Leadership doesn't get to choose. That's a critical function when you start, that's, again, this is all about control. When you start taking control away from the party insiders, they lose some of their power. That includes party leadership. Party leadership has a lot of advantages to a closed system. None of those advantages are for the voters. And quite frankly, none of those advantages are for rank and file elected members either. But for the insiders, the unelected bureaucratic insiders in the party, and for the party leadership, well, hey, they're kings and queens for a day with the rules they get to write. It doesn't work for the people, but it works for them.
Great. So it looks like we have one comment in the chat. Is there something in the chat, Haley?
It's not a question, it's a comment. It's from Debbie Smith. She says, I'm a lifelong NPA and could vote in the primaries in every other state I've lived. There are many folks who move here and are shut out from primaries. It stifles interest and participation.
Okay. Well, and that explains, you said there was 41 states that have open primaries, so that makes sense.
Right. Including, quite frankly, most of the states that surround Florida. That's part of the reason. You have two big feeders, right? Two big feeders for why Florida has so many NPA voters. One, because a lot of people come from the South, and most of the South already has open primaries. And the second, and this is actually important, we didn't talk about this, but it's actually a really important issue. Young people don't want to join a party. Hey, Republicans and Democrats, young people don't want to join a party. Over 50% of millennials are independent voters. An even larger percentage of Gen Zers, that's the demographic that's just now coming in to vote, are NPA voters. So if you want to reach young voters, whether you're the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, they're overwhelmingly registered independent. That's why independents are, in particular in Florida, are growing. Because Florida has a lot of young people, and they're not joining the parties. The parties are losing members. Both parties are losing members in Florida. That's a fact. Where are all those voters going? Well, they're all going to NPA, and the biggest percentage of them are the young people. They don't want to join a party, but they want to vote. They're our next generation of voters. We either build connections with them, we either respect their choice to not want to join a party, or both parties will face the consequences of that. because young people are not mistaken. They're not beholden to all this sort of insider tricks and special interest tricks to want to keep the primaries closed, telling them they have to join or get lost. They're having none of it. They're refusing to join a party. That's a fact. So what are you going to do with all the young people, over 50% of which are registered NPA? Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to continue to disenfranchise them? Or are you going to say, you know what? You're the future of the state of Florida. We respect your choice, and we're going to give you the right to vote. And both parties can and should build alliances to those voters and connect with them and organize them and try to convince them that their position's the right one. But I'll tell you what, telling them to join their party is not working, because they're not. So take them as they are. They're NPA voters. You're either going to let them vote or you're not. And you're either going to really believe that you support democracy, that you support equality, that you support inclusion, or you don't. I mean, do you only support those ideals when it advantages you, or do you actually support those ideals? Because the truth is that that's really what Amendment 3 is all about: equality and giving everybody the right to vote in every election. Period. It's that simple, but it's that challenging to the insiders, believe me.
What kind of system does Georgia have?
Georgia has an open primary that allows NPA voters to pick a primary.
So how did they do that? Because there was voter suppression there. They did a different way, their voter suppression.
Well, they obviously do different. There's a lot of different ways to suppress voters, but it's kind of interesting you raise that issue because so many states in the South, they have open primaries, but unlike Florida, where you register as a Republican or a Democrat or an NPA or a third party, in much of the South, they have nonpartisan registration. You register as a voter. Kind of sounds like, well, why don't we all just register as a voter? Why do we have to register as a party in order to vote? But in 20 states, including much of the South, you just register as a voter. So you have an open primary where everybody gets to pick a ballot. You're a Republican. You can vote in the Democratic primary. Why? Because you're not registered as a Republican. You may feel you're a Republican, but there's no registration. And so that's the system they have in the South. It's certainly better than Florida, no question. But it has a lot of limitations, some of which we've talked about in terms of top two versus that system. There's a lot of choices and flexibility and effects the top two have that you don't have in a more limited system like you have in some of these southern states. But NPA voters can vote. That's for sure. I was going to mention this is kind of fun, interesting. After the pre-clearance part of the Voting Rights Act was rolled back, and so states, particularly in the South, didn't have to pass the pre-clearance. You started seeing them go after open primaries. Why? Why is that? Why do you think the Republican Party in the South is starting to go after open primaries? Most of us think that it's because they see it as now that the pre-clearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act have been rolled back, it's a new front to go after Black voters. Obviously, there's some folks in Florida who think closed primaries are good for Black voters, but the Republicans in much of the South think quite the opposite. They think closed primaries benefit the Republican Party over Black voters. So that's kind of an interesting argument between what some of these proponents in Florida think and what the Republicans in much of the South think about closed versus open primaries.
I do know that we had a stop time, I think, of 1:55 on your end, Jeremy. So do we want to maybe wrap it up here?
I'm happy. I can go for a few more minutes. It's really up to you.
Okay. Well, I think we are done unless there's some more in the chat. Looks like there's something else in the chat.
There is an exclamation mark from Daphne.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Jeremy, for coming on and educating us on this issue, on this side of the issue, and gives us a lot to think about. And I'm definitely going to want to look more at the traditional primary as opposed to the top two and get more information on that. But you've been very, very helpful. Appreciate you coming on. And it was very nice meeting you, and I'm sure we'll run into each other again.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Please, if there are any discussions, debates, sessions where I can be helpful in talking about this issue more, please let me know. Certainly anybody who's interested, again, can go to floridaopenprimaries.org to get involved and to learn more. But this is an important voter empowerment issue. 4 million voters is a lot of voters that can't vote. It's the largest act of voter suppression in the state. It's got to stop. It's got to stop. And we have a chance to do that with Amendment 3.
All right. Well, thank you, and have a good rest of your week, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.